ladies and gentlemen, Kurt Sasek here, president of Winetasters Choice. I'm very happy, very proud to announce we have Mr. Steve Kirwan. He has been a very successful freelance writer, reviewing Scotch and wines and so forth. He's had a number of successful blogs, and he's had one even so successful that it got purchased by the Wall Street Journal. He also is a writer as well, and so he's very well versed, very knowledgeable when it comes to wine and Scotch, and he's going to spend some time with us. He's been generous enough to give us some of his time. So, Steve, thank you very much. And could you just please start off, just give us a little bio about yourself, because you've been doing this since the 80s, so you clearly have a strong and lengthy background in this field, giving you a wonderful expertise.
Well, thank you. I appreciate it. I want to say hello to everybody out there in TV land. I am coming to you live right now from my little YouTube studio myself. I'll peek out of the way. There's my little whiskey bar right
Looks
behind
beautiful.
me there. Yeah. I started many years ago. Actually, I was in the corporate field. I decided I wanted to go into business for myself. I started learning about computer repair. And I went into business doing my own computer repair business. And that actually led me into some of my customers asking me to help them set up websites. This was back in the late 80s, going into the early 90s. So I cut my teeth on developing websites, really trial by fire, learning on the go, helping small businesses set up websites. And somewhere along the way, I turned my passion. I had a passion for wine tasting. And my wife and I used to go wine tasting all the time. I lived in Northern California. So we were up in Napa and Sonoma, Livermore, all the wine, even in the Santa Clara region, which is where we were living, San Jose, California. Turned that into an interest, the wine tasting, which eventually became a sideline for me. I started writing articles about wine tasting. It was really a focus on wine tasting and the joy of wine tasting. So there were lots of people who talked about wine and the wines themselves. I really wanted to focus more on the experience of wine. So I spent a lot of time going up to the wine country, meeting winemakers, talking to the people who worked at the wineries, getting to know them. That led me to being able to do some writing about the travel aspect of it, and then eventually about the wine itself, which is what brought me to create my first wine tasting website, which was Wine Journal.
Okay, and that's the one you sold to the Wall Street Journal, right?
Right. So after several years of writing on it, it had developed. I put a lot of time and effort. I can figure, thinking back over the time, probably several hundred hours in the development and the research and the writing for the website. At that point in time, it was probably pretty close to 150 pages worth of, web pages worth of information. And I got approached out of the blue by somebody who wanted to know if I'd be willing to sell the website. And I thought it was a joke. Yeah, you get that. I had dabbled in domain name prospecting for a while. I thought somebody was, kind of pulling my leg. So I just threw out a wild number. I told them, sure, 50 grand, no problem. Well, they came back with an offer. It wasn't quite that, but it was an offer that caught my attention. And we went through a short period of negotiation. And after about, maybe 3 or 4 weeks, they made me an offer and sent me a check, and I transferred the domain name. It went through a domain, we call it like an escrow, went through domain escrow, and I'll be darned, then I found out I had sold it to the Wall Street Journal. I didn't know who I was selling it to at the time, or else the price might have had an extra zero on the end of it.
Yeah.
But that said, I got enough money to actually make a down payment on a house that we bought.
Nice. Well, congratulations. Now, there are plenty of great blogs, not to detract from yours, but obviously you have to have great content for somebody to be interested, but what do you think you did different that made, I mean, the Wall Street Journal, that's not a small thing.
Right.
What does one do in their writing or their blog to make the Wall Street Journal want to buy it? Again, I know you have to have great content, but there must have been something. What was the secret sauce, or what was the?
Well, I like to say it had to do with the fact that I kept the content down to earth. In truth, it was just because of the sheer numbers. The fact that they're the Wall Street Journal, mine was the Wine Journal, sort of, 1 + 1 = 2. They would not have been interested in it if I hadn't built. I mean, I had tens of thousands of daily views. So I had to get it to the point where people were coming to it for them to care about it. That's the reason I was able to sell it for really, significantly far above what I would have considered market value. Again, not knowing it was the Wall Street Journal, I probably undersold myself. But hey, you know what? I don't care. It was a great experience. If you're going to create a blog, you have to have content that people care about. And it has to be different enough that people will come to it. And that's how I focused on it, because nobody at the time was focused on wine tasting. Everybody was focused on writing, reviews about wines. And there were a lot of really great websites already there for that. I just focused on a slight different content, and that differentiated my site from some of the others.
Okay, and then to develop a successful blog like you did, what kind of commitment does that take? With you don't need to go into too much detail, but are you talking like, well, if you want a successful blog, obviously you have to have a niche, which you did. But were you posting content daily or 4 days a week? What do you feel is
I put in 3 to 5 hours a day.
Okay, all right.
And I was putting in more time back then, but now with what I do with my whiskeytrends.com, I'm putting in 3 to 5 hours a day of writing, editing, research, interviewing, and then of course tweaking the actual blog itself. That's an everyday activity.
Okay. Oh, and for everybody watching, Steve's website is called Whiskey Trends, all one word, whiskeytrends.com. Steve, could you please give us just some basic understanding of whiskey?
Of course, yeah. So in a nutshell, whiskey is an alcoholic beverage that is distilled from a mash made of grains. It's fermented grains. The easiest way to describe it is distilled beer. The process used to make beer is very similar to the process to make the material that they distill to make whiskey from.
Oh, I've never heard of it that way.
Wine, the fermented wine is used to make cognac and brandy. Fermented barley, wheat, corn, rye, and other grains are used to distill into whiskey.
So instead of grapes, you're thinking of grains or barley or cereals.
Precisely. Cereal grains equal whiskey. The process is similar. You mix the seed with water. You add yeast to it. You let it ferment. Once it's fermented to whatever the stage the individual producer wants it to be, it goes through the distillation process. And depending on what the grain is that's used, determines which distillation process is used. So for some, they use pot stills. For others, they use column stills. It's a little technical, but just think of malted barley goes through the old traditional method, which is what's used for Scotch and Irish whiskey. Other grains go through a newer method that was introduced that allows grain whiskey to be made. They each have their own unique characteristics. They can be blended. And in fact, the #1 selling whiskey in the world is blended Scotch. And it's made from a combination of malt whiskey, from barley malt, and grain whiskey. In fact, 90% of all Scotch sold in the world is blended Scotch.
Now, could you briefly take us through the different types of whiskey? You have Scotch whiskey, Irish, you have bourbon. So just give us a brief tour of the basic different types of whiskey, please.
Of course. And to do that, we really do need just cover a very brief history of whiskey. So back in ancient times in Egypt and separately in China, the distillation process was used to create perfumes that wouldn't spoil.
Oh.
Monks, European monks traveling into those areas brought the process back so that they could convert the wines that spoil easily that they would take on their treks. They would convert that into a distillate that wouldn't spoil. So it's European monks really created the process. But it was Irish monks who took the process, originally used mostly with grapes, and applied it to grain. So the Irish monks brought it to Ireland. From there, it went to Scotland. And there were differences that developed. And it's important to understand. The only real difference between Irish whiskey and Scotch whiskey is Irish whiskey is made in Ireland and Scotch whiskey is made in Scotland. American whiskeys, which in many cases were brought over by Irish immigrants, came here, and of course they started using the grains that were available here. In fact, I just read an interesting article. Barley is one of the hardest grains to grow in America, which is the reason that they started using corn. Of course, corn is what the base is for bourbon. And then rye grows wild here. It was used to make rye whiskey. And then, of course, Canadian whiskey started. It moved to Canada. They used grains there to make most of their whiskeys. And then it spread out around the world from there. It was actually because of the great phylloxera death of the French vineyards in the late 1800s that catapulted Scotch into the #1 selling spirit in the world. And after that, it never went back. So these other countries adapted it to their own products. And that's how we've had the differentiation. But the history and the regimen required for bourbon is just as tight and interesting as the history of Scotch and the history of Irish whiskey. They're all slightly different based on the methods that are set by law and the materials that are used. But basically, they're all the same generalized product. It's just how they're made and the flavor differentials based on the kinds of things that they do when they produce it, like the type of wood casks that it's aged in.